The prevailing colors are gold and cream. The wainscoting is white with gold trimmings at the top. The rail in front of the balcony is beautifully festooned with gold and cream, with a streamer of holly at the base and an American shield over each column supporting the balcony. The top of the rail in front of the private boxes is covered with holly, on which will be laid a bed of roses. Flowers will be used in profusion in giving the finishing touches to the decorations. Each column in the hall is entwined with evergreens, and at the top is a small American shield. Evergreens are tacked around the frame of each door and window, while an American shield surrounded by American flags, beautifully festooned, adorns the top of each window. Festooning of gold and cream-colored cloth is stretched in different directions from each side of the room at the ceilings to the center. The decorative painting by Rettig will be the cynosure of all eyes in the hall. The grand border immediately above the stage is a painting representing a colossal American flag, 45 feet in width, the stars in the blue field being arranged according to Grafton's idea. The 13 stars representing the 13 original states are larger than the stars representing the other states, and form a large circle in the center of the blue field, while the 32 smaller stars are grouped around the circle, making 45 stars in all, and the arrangement so that other stars can be added without disarranging the groups already fixed. In the center of the flag is a large winged medallion representing Mercury astride a wheel, and surrounded by gracefully draped banners. The panels on either side of the walls of the auditorium are beautifully decorated, one containing a figure representing commerce, the other a colossal, idealized Indian woman representing America, and both surrounded by the implements of commerce.
Welcome, listeners, to the founding convention of the National Association of Manufacturers in Cincinnati, Ohio, 1895. And also to this show, The State Between Us. I will be your host for both, Fritz McLinden. So how do you like that flag, huh? The original Dutch English colonies, printed large and central. Infinite room for more states to be added. And the Roman god Mercury, right in the middle, the god of commerce and trickery, and leading souls to the underworld. And the wainscoting. Come on. The National Association of Manufacturers, our beloved NAM, the NAM, has made plenty of appearances on this show already. If you recall, we owe to NAM the great pleasure of Tim LaHaye's Council for National Policy in the 1980s, and the John Birch Society in the 50s and 60s, whose founder, Robert Welch, was a 7-year veteran of the NAM Board of Directors, as well as spending 3 years as a regional vice president and 2 years as chairman of its Educational Advisory Committee, heir to NAM's massive propaganda efforts that we'll talk about today that date back to about 1904. Before that, NAM also provided its support for the America First movement, for Mervyn K. Hart and his network of phalangists and fascists and Nazis, and most importantly, for the American Legion, in its literal legions of strikebreakers and thugs led by the creamiest old money crop of the US of A. But how did they come to be? We will get back to that convention hall, that festooned hall, again later. But this is an origin story episode, buddy. So hold your horses. This episode is in great debt to Sarah Lyon Watts's 1992 work of labor history titled Order Against Chaos, Business Culture and Labor Ideology in America, 1880 to 1915. This and other sources will be included in the show description at patreon.com/thestateBetweenus. We're going to stick with Dr. Watts' analysis of the National Association of Manufacturers prehistory, which means to y'all that in part 1, we'll be looking at the whole Pullman train car manufacturing situation and, town in the last decades of the 19th century that contributed to this developing corporatist science of management that is sort of behind all of what we're talking about today, which is still in the story in its tadpole stage. And then in part 2, we'll examine the maturation of capitalist class war tactics in the political sphere with their consolidation under NAM, under the National Association of Manufacturers, the biggest fish in a quickly crowding pond of industrial lobbyists at the turn of the century. Before we start with them parts, though, let's push the time travel dial back a bit further than we need to and witness I'm going to call it the first big whoopsie on this blooper reel called Americanism, and that is going to be democracy. Now, before the 1830s, let's say, democracy was the name of an adorable pet kept on a very short leash by the old Anglo-Dutch families in elegant New England cities. But then, around the 1930s, a mass ethnic cleanser and a murderer of his political rivals, President Andrew Jackson, decided he was the perfect champion to liberate democracy from its gilded cage. I mean, with that resume, who can blame him? Sure, true, the expansion of democracy to most white men was already guaranteed at that point, and okay, he did move massive populations of native peoples against their will into soul-sucking reservations, and fine, women, black people, Asians, Hispanics, they couldn't have a say in any of it. But, and I mean but, at least non-blue-blooded rich people had a place to exert political power over all those other people for once. Democracy solved. It's telling also that in the second term of the Trump administration, Trump early on cited Andrew Jackson as his hero, the guy that opened up the state to new rich bourgeoisie types who were not beloved by the old blue bloods. Very similar to our golden boy. So bourgeois democracy, in the pettiest possible way, it's a pun, reigned supreme from that point until the Civil War, when, as we discussed in episode 15 on the American race, even those ancient demons from Boston had to admit that these plucky Protestants could put together an industrial war machine pretty good. Thus, Sarah Watts writes, the antebellum Republican politics of deference was transformed after the war into liberal republicanism that acknowledged the new, quote, virtues of materialism and acquisitiveness, and incorporated bourgeois liberal concepts of property, markets, wages, and labor into evolving definitions of the American promise. So personally, I'm still getting, acquainted with this period, but to my reading so far, this is the first time I'm seeing that democracy as a concept and capitalism as a concept would be conceptually joined together in the political self-image of the United States. Like peanut butter and chocolate, this combination would prove itself an extremely durable marriage. But unlike peanut butter and chocolate, it tasted like shit. So, war turned industry into a problem of technique, of tactics even, engineering and science. No longer would the ruling class look at the market as a disdainful waste of talent, but rather a new frontier of exploration where new ways of fucking everyone over awaited the intrepid explorer of the developing science of management. On the flip side, the post-Civil War Republican spirit would no longer see labor as a sort of morally instructive, like, symbol of self-discovery and building independence and, community and whatnot. But rather they saw it during the war as a question of time, of output, and what to do with the annoying humanity lodged inside our army of working meat machines. You see, when the war ends, But wartime production pressures carry on, even multiply during the peace. A worker's going to have a thing or two to say about that. Populism and labor agitation break branching, multiplying cracks across the surface of this creamy white table they have called democracy, and seriously problematize the new science of unlimited capital expansion. The best thing, though, about having a ruling class is that, there's just no end to the well of very bright and special boys with the biggest brains in the whole world coming up with amazing ideas for how to make us all do what they want. It's great. It's pretty great. Think about it, China. Well, the very clever and very handsome little genius that would come to the rescue of America's Republican democracy and save it from dumb, ugly workers was none other than George Mortimer Pullman, owner of the Pullman Palace Car Company, famous for its elegant, long-distance sleeping wagons that practically monopolized the sleeping and dining car experience for the entire country. Which brings us to part one, Pullman. I'm going to call it... No, we'll just call it Pullman. So George Pullman's dad was a carpenter in New York who had invented a way to elevate and even move large buildings, a method he invented while widening a New York canal. When he died, young George Pullman inherited the family business bench pressing towns. In the early 1860s, he got contracted by the city of Chicago to lift their towering blocks out of the swamp they built them on, and he did a good job of it. Using this very public success as leverage, George Pullman launches his sleeper car career and manages to score Lincoln's body for Lincoln Corpse's final cross-country tour after his assassination. Pullman was doing real numbers now, and he quickly joined the ranks of the nouveau riche who had become the symbol of the new age of liberal capitalism. The only problem with being, well, not the only problem, the biggest problem with being a capitalist is that you have to make capital like literally all the time. And while Pullman will be absolutely goddamned before he accepts the labor theory of value, he at least grows to admit that he does feel a bit less fat of a cat when his dirty honkies go on strike. Pullman assumes that the reason his workers seem unhappy is that they're dumb and they don't shower. And he, George motherfucking Pullman, lifter of city blocks, can civilize them. He could maybe quell their innate predilections to disorder and resistance. He could stop the ominous shadow of the Paris Commune. So, by 1873, Georgie began where others had before him, when they also had this brilliant idea. He starts with the YMCA, keeping young people from growing idle. He gets involved with the Chicago Manual Training School, trading, skills to people for their future loyalty. He works with the Citizens Law and Order League, keeping poor kids off the drink. And finally, he introduces the Pullman Mutual Benefit Association in his own sleeper car factories, offering meals, baths, libraries, and other social services to his workers. How well this was executed and how much workers had to pay for it, I can't say. But for some reason, it didn't stop his workers from hating capitalism. Maybe the burgers were dry. Indeed, by 1877, the workers had gone so feral that they managed to cripple the railroad in a series of strikes. Listeners will recognize this, if they're listening to the show, as the origin story of John Hay, author of the proto-fashific book The Breadwinners, whose rail magnate father-in-law was at the center of the reckless, horrible tragedy that kicked the whole 1877 strike wave off. Well, the great nemesis of John Hay and his infamous buddy, Alan Pinkerton, of the Alan Pinkerton Project, was a mutual aid and solidarity organization called Knights of Labor. And as the Knights of Labor's numbers swelled in the wake of the 1877 rail strikes, the Pinkertons, the Hayeses, the Pullmans, the Carnegies, etc. of the world started getting worried. Despite their efforts at making totally not scammy company stores, gently extracting rents from their workforce and very helpfully telling them what to do all the time, their stupid workers seem to prefer the multitude of labor associations popping up left and right instead of the generous prison they were building for these. Labor was beginning to see itself as a class in irreconcilable opposition to capital. Capital preferred to see labor as a malfunctioning body part, a hand that wants to play at being the head. The head is for head jobs. The hand is, as workers formed unions and talked about class solidarity, capital began to develop a language of corporatism and social solidarity. They began to position themselves as the defenders of order, which they called democracy, against chaos, which is their word for socialism. But in this age of engineering calling itself science, Pullman, George in particular, believed there was some social experiments left to be run. So he got to social engineering. Could these racial communists be trained to do tricks and behave? More importantly, could he turn a profit out of it? At this time, George Pullman's industrialist buddies were embarking on a massive propaganda campaign advocating for universal education for the working class so that the working class would stop listening to, more experienced workers, for instance, or maybe even their priests telling them about, Jesus, self-sacrifice and the community of the Holy Spirit and stuff like that, instead of reading, stuff about political economy or labor corporatism. Here's a quote from Order and Chaos.
We have been too much inclined to hold a few half-starved clergymen chiefly responsible for the moral culture of the masses, charged an Atlantic Monthly editorialist in 1878. Capital must protect itself by organized activities for a new object, the education of the people. Labor, made thus intelligent, predicted Dexter Hawkins of the New York Association for the Protection of American Industry, will harmonize itself with capital.
So trade magazines began obsessing over the new science of managing men, literally titling articles, How to Handle Men, which is not at all what it sounds like. Pullman also wanted to handle men, lots of them. In fact, he felt like he could handle a whole town of men and solve their educational problem by literally making them live in a Pullman Palace Car Company theme park disguised as a terrifying middle-class suburb, one of the first of its kind. He named his little town inside Chicago the town of Pullman. What else would he do? Just an aside, anyone who hasn't seen Severance yet should maybe check it out. I'm not trying to spoil anything, but I'm just thinking about it right now because it turns out it's not sci-fi, it's history. So, Pullman constructed this town to represent in hard brick the class composition of the Pullman Company body. His skilled workers, managers, engineers, etc. got to live in large, spacious homes closer to both entertainment amenities as well as symbols of power like the arcade, a fancier version of the company store in a mall form. There was a huge theater. There was the towering Florence Hotel named for his daughter. And Pullman's library, which claimed to be built to enrich the minds of workers, but he, in fact, even the architecture kind of instinctively steered people away from it. It was very gaudy and imposing, very unfriendly. Drinking was forbidden in Pullman, except in Pullman's own salon in that library, where his circle of, Pullman chosen ones and his capitalist friends and visiting delegations and whatever would drink freely in plain sight of sober and overworked denizens who scampered by. Again, from Sarah Watts' Order and Chaos.
In an age of free libraries, Pullman's library patrons paid an annual fee of $3, equal to a day and a half's work for an ordinary laborer, which, coupled with the intimidation of its luxuriousness, kept annual membership near 200 patrons out of a pool of 5,500 workers in Pullman in 1893. The library also charged for its classes in stenography, history, languages, literature, and civics. Like the library, the richly appointed 800-seat theater separated those who paid 35, 50, and 75 cents a seat for the more wealthy occupants of the Moorish-designed boxes in the balcony. In an attempt to refine theater-goers' taste upward, the company excluded, quote, immoral theater presentations in favor of, quote, innocent amusement. The town's other public buildings included a free school for employees' children, a church, a casino, a firehouse, and a stable, which housed both the town's workhorses and wealthy residents' pleasure horses.
So an interesting side note there, Pullman had, like I said, their one company-approved church in the town, and historians of Pullman have described it as a generic Christian church. Pullman had disallowed pretty much any kind of ethnic or religious organization within the town outside of this, quote, generic Christian church. And the generic Christian kind of label hits differently when you know that this story eventually ends up creating the John Birch Society and the Left Behind series and, this NAM industrial Jesus that is very much a generic Christian. But anyway, workers were subtly and not so subtly pressed to rent homes in Pullman. They were not allowed to buy. It was impossible to own anything in Pullman, except for, little consumer goods and stuff. And they would give, in Pullman's factories, certain rewards or, statuses, or they'd at least be a little easier on you if you were renting in Pullman. So there was this push to do it. It was difficult to do. There was a lot of people subletting in very tiny row houses in the unskilled sections. So unskilled laborers who managed to make it into the neighborhood found themselves barely affording their lives there in buildings that were shamefully cramped compared to their better off neighbors and dwarfed by the monuments to Pullman's own power, like the library. Again, from Order and Chaos.
These homes consisted of unbroken rows of brick tenements, where, in each block, up to 500 persons lived under one roof in nearly identical 2 to 5 family dwellings. Each building had a narrow strip of front lawn and a small back lot that, one worker complained, barely accommodated a clothesline and allowed no space for a garden. A visitor found that, quote, the monotony and regularity of the buildings gives one the impression that he is living in a soldier's barracks.
George's idea was that these poor people, with barely enough room to clean their clothes, would be inspired to clean their clothes anyway when they see how, properly their bourgeois neighbors live uptown. This place was really weird, too, on many levels. For instance, in order to teach workers' wives, because it was an all-male labor force, it was a mostly male labor force, and the town itself, it was something like a 3-to-1 male to female ratio in the town. But in order to teach the workers' wives proper bourgeois consumer habits, the Pullman Arcade would plan events where, one that I read was that new wallpaper would get delivered to this painfully limited selections in the company store. And then Pullman would kind of send hype women out into town, dressed as moms and wives, I guess, to talk excitedly about the new wallpapers and basically go to your house, knock on your door, and then hype up the wallpaper and then offer you help in going to choose them. And then in turn, you were expected to go and tell the other wives in the neighborhood in an equally excitable way. And, there was pressure to sanction, emotionally sanction women who didn't show some slavish interest in the new wallpapers. So one gets the sense from visitors that Pullman had built the whole town directly inside the Uncanny Valley itself, if the Uncanny Valley had an admission fee and a gift shop. Another observer visiting in 1885 reported that the town of Pullman struck him as, quote,
a crude attempt to resurrect the ideas of medieval barons who took pride in fostering villages beneath their castle towers, from which they looked down in lordly condescension on their humble retainers. A blight suspended like a black cloud over Pullman City, and crushes out the spirit of fun, of humor, and of independence from the hearts and the thoughts of their people. There was not a single independent man outside of Mr. Pullman.
I mean, I've read some bad reviews, but that's bad. The state, however, really liked it. A government commission on Pullman Town, in fact, concluded, this isn't sarcastic, this is real, they said,
if the workman at Pullman lives in a, quote, gilded cage, we must congratulate him on its being so handsomely gilded. The average workman does not even have his cage gilded.
That's real. That's what they said. Reports also revealed a, quote, needless air of secrecy in the operation of the town and ascribed it to the nature of a machine where, for the citizens, quote, everything is done for him, nothing by him. Pullman himself, George, was actually shocked when his workers/citizens went on strike as part of the great strike wave of 1886 for the 8-hour workday, which would ultimately culminate in the infamous Haymarket Affair and the fatal sentencing of the Chicago Eight, I think 4 of whom were actually hanged. And this marked the beginning of the end for the Knights of Labor as well, and the beginning of the American Federation of Labor, which rose to take the Knights' place, replacing the idea of class solidarity, which, to be fair, the Knights of Labor didn't have a great handle on, but they had some handle on it. But the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, replaced that idea with an embrace of cooperative corporatism, working with capital instead of against it. This is the origin of the tripartite system of labor that the U.S. Still suffers from today, the state, capital, and labor in one happy little triangle trade. So when in 1894, George, responding to sort of an economic depression at the time, he cut wages, or I should say rather, he cut piece rates. They weren't even like legitimate wages. They were piece rates for his workers. But he did not cut rents. He still needed this thing to make money. George needed Pullman Town to prove that civilizing the working man was profitable. But his workers, rebelled. Their lives were just as expensive. They were under no illusions that the entire cost of their lives was devoted to Pullman. I mean, Pullman gave them their wages and then took them right back through rents and company stores, etc. They knew that, and they were pissed. Even in this moment, by the way, where labor organizations were suffering after the Haymarket Affair from a publicity crisis. Like capital really marshaled command of the media that it owned and created. In fact, mass media was created to support political campaigns, which overtly centered capitalism as the heart of Americanism. Like this apparatus existed, and because of that, labor unions were suffering in the public eye. But the workers of Pullman fought through that. They made contact with Eugene Debs and the American Rail Workers Union, and they struck. They went on strike. And this was a very public strike that echoed throughout the industrial world. The strike of 1894 was actually a watershed moment for both the American labor movement and for the armies of capital. In stark contrast from the recent past, when Knights of Labor workers would straight up compete with the Brotherhood of Rail Workers for who could scab each other's factories the hardest. It was not a good situation. The American Railroad Union, led by Eugene Debs, begrudgingly agreed to sympathy boycotts and strikes for the rail workers in Pullman, between Chicago and Detroit and beyond. Rail workers were refusing to service any car from the Pullman Company in solidarity for these Pullman rents. Sadly, Eugene Debs' American Railroad Union, the ARU, it did at the time refuse to organize black workers who made up a really sizable portion of the unskilled labor pool at Pullman, specifically as criminally underpaid porters. The new right hand of railroad magnates in America, called the General Managers Association, the GMA, scored a federal injunction against Eugene Debs and the American Railroad Union from participating in sympathy strikes on the painfully ironic grounds that the American Railroad Union was a cartel that was interfering in the free market of independent labor. That's fucking crazy. So a cartel, a literal cartel of railway magnates got federal troops to kill something like 30 people in Chicago because the state agreed that, in fact, the unions were the real cartels. It's America. Debs was arrested, and with total control over the press, the capitalists managed to turn the public tide against the Pullman strikers, against workers in general, who were portrayed as the grubby enemies of the democratic order. From this point on, both Debs and the capitalists would turn their focus to taking the state. And I'm sorry if this spoils anything, but the socialists did not win. The collapse of Pullman as a town, as a corporatist experiment, was not for nothing, however. Despite property damage reaching upwards of $80 million in the 94 strikes, apologists for Pullman Town noted that, relatively little property damage was done to Pullman during the 1886 strikes. It seemed that total paternalistic control over one little town was not enough, but it did something. Its successes provided a model for what is, I would, say is a scalar leap into other forms of spatial and ideological engineering on just, vast scales. For one, Pullman had managed to create a loyal middle-class strata of committed consumers that helped subdivide the working class against itself, which Capital interpreted as the, quote, good worker versus, quote, bad worker dynamic. Good workers were people like the American Federation of Labor at worst, represented by Samuel Gompers. The good workers, like them, forbade sympathy strikes and boycotts, and they urged corporatist collaboration with capital. Bad workers, like the Debs American Railway Union,
represented the final onslaught of the deep-seated malady, a cancerous growth, which has been deliberately planted in the social system of the country and has been fostered there till it struck roots, which will not be torn out without the rending of tissue and the spilling of blood. Its existence is a menace to the nation,
wrote the capitalists. So the final lesson here in Pullman revolved around Pullman's personal attempts to politically rally his citizen workers to vote for his preferred candidates. This failed miserably when he tried it, and it provoked a large public outrage. And so, they learned that future attempts to try to create a controllable political subject out of the working class needed to be a little less brash. Pullman, Georgie, died in 1897. In the years that followed, both saloons and unions proliferated in the neighborhood that he had so carefully pruned of vice and class politics, and the imposing Hotel Florence, named after his daughter, would become one of Chicago's most famous brothels later in the 20th century. But back in 1902, Pullman Town became the center of a series of strikes and organized labor, but this lasted only until a union-busting lockout severed the organized workers from their workplaces as the company replaced them with permanent scabs and only let people return if they would sign a loyalty pledge disavowing union membership. For both organized labor and for capital, at that point, the Pullman experiment had ended. Part 2. The counteroffensive. From the GMA to the NAM. The General Managers Association, formed in 1886 by 24 railroad firms with lines based in or terminating in Chicago, represented some $2 billion in collective capital and the interests of over 50,000 shareholders. They ruled 220,000 odd workers with an iron fist. During the 1886 battle for the 8-hour day, the General Managers Association, the GMA, acted as a command center for the counter-revolution. They pooled their money to hire platoons of strike-breaking thugs, kept a common blacklist of agitators, which is a very, very familiar theme on this show, by the way. They coordinated media coverage through their ruling class comrades and literally directed federal forces from their Chicago office. The fucking, commander of the platoon, whatever, would come in and take orders from these railroad monopoly men. The formation of the GMA marks a definitive moment in the development of ruling class consciousness. In some ways, this gave them a leg up for a time over the infighting and competition between existing labor organizations like Knights of Labor. My impression is that your average worker at the time did in fact have probably, a well-developed sense of class solidarity. I mean, it was hard to ignore these massive strikes that were going on. But the problem was that the workers' representative organs were, kind of struggling to catch up to that. There was a lot of bullshit going on. This was not so for the GMA, which was welcomed by the entire ruling class, including the U.S. government, as a savior of the Republic. When the resident workers of Pullman struck in 1894 for lower rents and a more predictable peace pay system, as we said, Pullman himself, King George, the control freak of his little Chicago fiefdom, straight up gave away his authority to the GMA to handle his subjects for him. He just said, you guys deal with it. He submitted to the GMA. The GMA, the General Managers Association, ran into some unexpected stumbling blocks, though, because they had, at the time, a kind of labor-sympathetic governor in Illinois who himself had actually saved 4 of the 8 Haymarket anarchists from the noose, and he was refusing offers of federal military intervention in his city, which the GMA was demanding. Up to this point, the summer strikes and protests had been mostly peaceful, and the governor feared that sending in federal troops would inflame the situation. Wait, why does this sound familiar? What time is this again? I know this sounds kind of Chicago today, Minneapolis today. It is. It's the same. As the GMA flooded the streets with armed strike breakers and federal agents anyway, having easily gotten their federal injunction against the ARU, as I mentioned, class war erupted in the streets, and Chicago spent 2 days in July entirely under worker control, but in a state of open war, with 50,000 protesters, strikers, and sympathizers fighting back against federal forces. And in the process, they were burning rail cars, they were tearing up tracks, and they even, I'm not sure if they did it, but at the end of the day, an iconic building of the Chicago World's Fair was put to the torch. The whimpering end that the 1894 strike movement sort of landed on proved to be a crippling blow to the U.S. labor movement. The state intervened on the side of capital. It was very clear what was going on. They owned the media. They had the feds. They had it all. Labor movement was decimated. And, the acquiescent American Federation of Labor grew bigger. It absorbed the wreckage of the industrial labor movement, leaving corporatism the most obvious path available for workers who wanted to improve their conditions. That is to say, workers who were willing to improve their conditions by improving their position over other laborers. As Debs and his comrades licked their wounds in prison and transitioned from industrial organizing into socialistic party politics, capital did not rest on its laurels. The General Managers Association was great and all, but American industry is much more than its railroads. What was needed and what 1895 would bring about in the wake of the Pullman strikes was a broader coalition of rising managerial talent in their diverse industries, whether it's Stetson hats or shitty breakfast cereals, and to ensure that this new and increasingly popular American socialist movement that was growing out of the defeated labor movement would be dead on arrival if it ever managed to get to D.C. So hundreds of wealthy upstart industrialists made their way to that Festoon Cincinnati Hall I described in the introduction to agree to the creation of a national organization of capitalists that will foster, among other things, techniques of scientific management, an atmosphere of political compliance in D.C., and a program of popular education to keep the population where they landed after the spectacles of the Chicago Revolt. I mean, to keep them kind of on the suspicious side of the working man and envious of the chaos of the strikes and envious of middle-class dignity and success. They knew that this wouldn't last long. This is a window, it opens, it closes. And as NAM President David M. Perry would openly acknowledge in some years as union membership once again saw itself on the rise, he said,
"Public opinion is the guiding force in this nation today. Organized labor owes its present power mainly to the support of public opinion. A propaganda for evil is to be neutralized only by a propaganda for good."
And if it wasn't clear what NAM meant by evil, Perry added,
"We have been intimidated by a handful of anarchists and so-called labor leaders. It is now time to settle this issue once and for all."
This was, obviously, the birth of the National Association of Manufacturers. NAM was no friend, however, to some of the favored labor organizations of the corporatists up to that point. They hated the American Federation of Labor. They hated the good laborers. The immediate predecessors to NAM, like the formidable National Civic Federation, they were willing to work with the AFL in a common corporate structure. But to the NAM, all labor organizing was part of the same alien enemy force out to destabilize our orderly industrial republic. From its official incorporation in 1903, the National Association of Manufacturers wasted no time in getting to work. From its high-rise headquarters, located 19 stories over Broadway in New York, the NAM began the massive propaganda campaign I had previously outlined in Episode 3 on the origins of the Council for National Policy. They went after politicians, priests, media managers, teachers, and even formed local, quote, citizens' alliances where they could spread the gospel of industrial supremacy over a corporatist society. In 6 months alone in 1910, NAM was able to boast almost 50,000 pamphlets delivered into the hands of community leaders across the country. They pioneered mass mailing techniques, they did press, PR offensives, and they participated in something they suspiciously referred to as, quote, revival meetings. It is estimated that NAM propaganda reached some 15 million people at a time when the U.S. had less than 100 million residents in total. NAM had become the most powerful industrial interest group in the country, representing some $22 billion in capital by 1908. David M. Perry, president of NAM, set the tone for the 20th century ruling class. This is a quote from Perry's inaugural call to arms after NAM was officially registered in 1903. But I've brought this quote to the show before. I brought it to episode 3 of The State Between Us, but I think it bears repeating here. This is the dude that said,
"Organized labor knows but one law, and that is the law of physical force, the law of the Huns and the Vandals, the law of the savage. It does not place its reliance on reason and justice, but in strikes, boycotts, and coercion. It is a mob power, knowing no master except its own will. Its history is stained with blood and ruin. It extends its tactics of coercion and intimidation over all classes, dictating to the press and to the politicians, and strangling the independence of thought."
I mean, sounds like projection. NAM even had its own clergy to back up the party line. NAM frequently referred to its education program as, quote, the gospel of industrial truth, going so far as to refer to God himself as, quote, the great manufacturer, whose agents on earth were the industrialists of America, claiming, and I quote,
"We take thy material in our hands, and we make it more marketable."
These people are real. To follow the ultimate result of this new religion, check out episode 8, which I called my Left Behind fanzine on Tim LaHaye. I will unlock it for all you freeloaders listening, but go ahead and click subscribe on the Patreon page while you're there. Anyway, as for organized labor's identity in the new faith, you had people like Reverend Maurice Wilson, who contributed his theological wisdom to the discussion at a NAM convention in 1909. This would be their theological take on the worker.
Workers strike out blindly against capital as though it were a public enemy, attempting to destroy that which they themselves are greedy to possess. They sting themselves into a rage against the educated classes, since they could not be educated themselves. Such persons seek to destroy that which they cannot enjoy themselves, rather than see it enjoyed by others.
You get it. Workers were selfishly hindering the nation's progress and order by dint of their own base nature, and the unions were their barbaric terrorist arm determined to destroy the sacred right of property, which guaranteed all American liberties. And the workers are going to do this, of course, by forming the largest cartel the world has ever seen, the labor movement, which NAM glibly referred to as the, quote, Muscle Trust, the Muscle Trust. By the time of this convention, the National Association of Manufacturers was home to such American corporate staples as Philip Morris, National Cash Register, that's NCR, Post Foods, Stetson, the hat guys, Westinghouse, and Studebaker, among many others. And they would soon be joined by the likes of Sunoco Oil and other NAMans as the decades wore on. Firestone, that shit. As I mentioned, the bulk of their ire was focused on the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, which had once worked so hard to be good labor for the paymasters. But now, as the 20th century dawned, the AFL found themselves dodging accusations of being a disloyal enemy alien within the body of the nation, with Reverend Wilson and people like NAM's chief counsel, James Emery, advocating for the federal government to deal with organized labor in the same way they dealt with the indigenous peoples of the country in times past. Again, please check out episode 15 of The State Between Us to hear more about the evolution of the, quote, Indian killer of the mid-19th century into the strikebreaker of the late 19th century. That's its own fucking story. Perry's NAM claimed that the organization, unlike the workers, asked for, quote, no class privilege, and stood only for, quote, the common good of the Republic. Perry's successor, NAM President George Pope, didn't even bother with that shit when he took office, openly calling for manufacturers, directly calling within their own circles for manufacturers to stand together as a class. That's literally what he said, even as NAM propaganda would claim at the same time that they were doing everything but that. NAM's emphasis on public education and the millions they spent lobbying for a universal open shop system in American industries, which means, of course, that unions don't have any say in hiring or training, that kind of thing. This emphasis was part of a larger struggle of American corporatists, scientific managers, to rip apart the traditional relationship of unionized experts of their particular craft, tear up that relationship between them and their apprentices. This was way too much worker control for them. Industry could cede this ground to the worker no longer. They framed it as an inefficiency, actually, and they saw the ultimate defeat of socialism in the total severance of incoming workers from the tutelage of their elders. They pushed the proliferation of technical schools where their industrial gospel could be drilled into people's heads as they learned how to operate the latest machinery on the lines. Over time, the NAM learned to cool its fire and brimstone rhetoric a bit, at least in its more public-facing circles, and build new outlets for their gospel in the forms of theo-fascist spiritual mobilizers of Reverend Fifield in the 1930s, in the form of conspira-brained capitalist Jesus stuff of Robert Welch's John Birch Society in the 50s, and then finally in the infamous Moral Majority co-founded by Tim LaHaye at the close of the 70s. But already in the lead up to the U.S. involvement in World War I, the NAM had already reset the discussion. They ceased harping on the evils of specific and increasingly less relevant unions and large labor organizations, and they instead managed to shift the political imagination of the labor question to one of inefficiency versus national interests. They would phrase it like, So the selfish short-sightedness of the materialistic demands for better treatment and higher wages was evil because it stood in the way of American progress, of geopolitical hegemony, and domestic peace just because it gummed up the works, right? They were dangerous because, yeah, they were dumb, whatever. They were dangerous, violent. You got all that. That's part of the media sphere. But I guess policy-wise, the labor movement was dangerous because it was inefficient, and we couldn't afford inefficiency. So World War I obviously intensifies that sentiment as socialists and anarchists and labor organizers are persecuted en masse under the charge of undermining national interest, of gumming up the works. And finally, NAM secures the death knell of the industrial workers of the world and wraps up the long Red Scare of the early 20th century by funding the American Legion's campaign of violence against them. Today, NAM is, weirdly enough, at odds with the Trump administration, which itself is very much a grandchild of NAM, of their work in the first part of the 20th century. NAM's current president and CEO is Jay Timmons, who, while signaling enthusiastic cooperation with the Trump administration in his first term, developed a very personal beef with Trump during the COVID period, blaming Trump for misinformation. And I think the implication is he kind of blames him for the death of like his father or grandfather or whatever during that time. Jay Timmons is also gay and doesn't really appreciate the Christian nationalism of this administration that, again, his own fucking organization basically created, or was at least like one of the 2 or 3 main pillars in the creation of. Yeah, fuck. So, some concluding remarks, maybe. We didn't really get into what American industrial corporatism actually is in this episode, which sucks, but I can, only squeeze so much into these little story boxes that I like to make. In the next episode, I want to return to that question and put it in a broader context of kind of the various corporatisms that come together to form Americanism. And as I continue to argue, the fascism endemic to Americanism. I'll be tying together the work that we've already assembled on this show, try to give some kind of review/synthesis, see if I can't help us figure out some current headlines. I don't know. We'll see. For this episode on NAM's origins, I just wanted to, lift a stone that's been sitting in my yard for a while and get a good look. It was all squirming around underneath that. So for patrons of the state between us, you also have part 2 of our in-house TTRPG adventure, As Above, So Below, to look forward to. Some surprises there. And to you free listeners, I'll see you in a week or 2. All right, patreon.com/thestateBetween.